Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tony Bernardo, the Dean of UCLA Anderson. We're very pleased that you could join us today. This is a session that's being sponsored by Impact at Anderson. Impact at Anderson is making a difference through a variety of initiatives, some having to do with technology, others with healthcare innovation, climate and sustainability, and including today's panel on perhaps the most timely topic we could be thinking about right now, and that's the future of work. I also want to give a brief plug for a future Impact event later this week on Friday, April 24 at 9:30 a.m. We're going to have a session on the future of food. And this will be a fireside chat between our interim faculty director of Impact at Anderson, Jennifer Walsky, and the co-founder of Honest Tea and the chairman of the board of Beyond Meat, Seth Goldman. So today's panel is going to explore the future of work from COVID-19 to automation to artificial intelligence. And this is co-hosted by Impact in Anderson, but also with the Easton Technology Management Center at UCLA Anderson and the Promise Institute for Human Rights in the UCLA School of Law, as well as UCLA Anderson's Net Impact Club. And I want to say that this event is really supporting two key priorities of the school. The first is a belief among really all of us, but one that we're really trying to push forward, that the most important and vexing issues facing society are by nature cross-disciplinary. And solutions are going to require expertise from a variety of fields and disciplines. And in my view, universities are really best positioned to be doing cross-disciplinary work. And so it's very heartening to see that we have on today's panel very distinguished leaders and experts, not just from the Anderson School, but also across campus at the law school and from government and business. So it's wonderful to see a community of experts and leaders across a variety of fields coming together to discuss this important issue. The second priority is that I put a lot of stress on since I became dean, and that is for Anderson and UCLA broadly to more fully embrace its public mission. I think it's an extraordinary asset that we belong to the #1 public university in the country, and an institution that explicitly has a mission to serve our region, the state, and really the broader world. And what that means is we need to be engaged in the most pressing issues that face our broader community. And it's wonderful to see this group of really very distinguished panelists taking up an issue of such broad importance. So I'm very, very happy that we have this wonderful panel to discuss this issue today. Moderating the panel is Terry Kramer, who is the faculty director of the Easton Center. Thank you, Terry, for putting together this, this event, and I'll hand it over to you now. Thank you.
Great, Tony, a big thank you, and thank you for your leadership at a critical time here. And let me just start out. It's great to see the level of engagement in this panel discussion here. You know, we all hear today what extraordinary times we live in. It's no longer an understatement to talk about how extraordinary the times are. And in today's discussion, we're going to look at how extraordinary the times are from a couple of angles. One is COVID-19 and how the whole set of issues about our own well-being and health and society's well-being is now being discussed so much, as well as the economic impact of COVID-19. But also the role of technology and how technology is affecting our lives, creating new products, new services, new companies, new industries, but also changing how we live our lives and the types of jobs that are out there. And we're going to do a specific deep dive here on the future of work and how those two items, COVID-19 and also the role of technology, are affecting the future of work. And whether that be a discussion about what types of jobs are going to be created in the future, how that requires a reskilling of jobs, how we have to think about where jobs are going to exist geographically in the state and in the country. And then longer term, is there going to be a reduction in the number of jobs with automation? And if so, how does society effectively deal with that? So I think there's a whole host of really interesting things to deal with here. I'm especially excited about the panel that we've got because they cover all aspects of leadership on these big issues. We have people from government, from industry, and from academia. And so that to me really is going to make up a great conversation. The three panelists that we have that I wanted to specifically welcome here, first of all, we're very, very fortunate to have California's Lieutenant Governor with us, Eleni Kounalakis. She's the first woman in history to hold the office of California Lieutenant Governor. She sits on a variety of important committees that are policy making in the state and beyond. One of them is the Council of Economic Advisors for the governor that's looking at a variety of issues today on COVID-19 and its impact on the economy. Second of all, we have with us from the UCLA Law School, very fortunate here, Ilana Zaidi, who's responsible for artificial intelligence, law, and policy, and is a Pulse Fellow at the UCLA Law School. And then finally, we have Matt Plummer here with us. Matt is responsible for product strategy at ZipRecruiter. So a special welcome to the three of you. Now, in terms of the format, I'm going to ask our three panelists a series of questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience questions. We're going to use Slido for the audience questions, so I encourage you to log in slido.com from any mobile device, laptop, etc., slido.com, and then you enter the event code here, and that's going to be FOWP, so Future of Work Panel. So FOWP, and then your questions will show up. You can either enter in your own question or you can upvote an existing one, and I will endeavor to ask as many of the most popular questions that come up. So let's get started. I'm going to ask this for each of our panelists. If you would just give us a window into your own world about COVID-19, how it's affecting you personally, how it's affecting your organizations, how it's affecting your sense of priorities, et cetera. And let's start with Lieutenant Governor.
Well, thank you very much, Terry. Thank you, Dean. It's great to be with you and to be with everyone who's tuned into this. And frankly, one of the things that has changed in my life is I do a lot of Zoom meetings and calls, sometimes things like this, other times, we had our UC Regents meeting via Zoom. And then my friends and my family, who many of whom are feeling a little cooped up and sometimes lonely. So I think that that's kind of probably something we all share in this new reality. But in terms of the office of the Lieutenant Governor, it's been a very busy 5 weeks. We started working early on international supply chains relative to food, and that sort of morphed into the whole mask debacle, which we now finally have some level of control around. And that's mostly because the governor had asked me over a year ago to serve as his representative for international affairs. So it was natural that we would be tasked to work in this area. But now that we have the health crisis somewhat in our arms around it, the number that most of us are watching every day are the number of people who are in ICU. It's about 1,200. We need to see that number start to fall before we can contemplate, or not contemplate, before we can enact any kind of easing of the stay-at-home orders. And there is quite a bit of focus right now about this secondary crisis to COVID, which is the economic crisis. And we all know, and you certainly at Anderson know very well, that what we are up against is very significant, a self-inflicted shutting down of our own economy. There's really no precedent for it. So the last few days, the governor announced a task force with all 4 living former governors of California, bipartisan, as well as a group of business leaders and others, He's asked me to serve on that task force as well. And that work is now in full swing. And I think the other thing, maybe the final thing that we've learned, is that we really don't know from day to day what the work holds for us, because it really has been a, a process where what we learn about this coronavirus, what we learn about how people are infected, how it spreads, how why some people get so sick and others don't. There are a lot of unknown questions around it.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, thank you again for having me. So from a personal level, much like Lieutenant Governor, sharing the similar experiences, kids at home, families all at home. Thankfully, we've kind of figured it out at this point. We're on now week 6 of our kind of own self-quarantine. So that's all been interesting to work through. But from a sort of a business point of view, our customers, which we have a front row seat into their sort of experience right now, is any company in the US that's hiring. And that's not a lot of them right now, unfortunately. We've worked with a lot of small businesses through the years, and small business hiring has pulled back significantly. Sort of larger company, national company hiring has pulled back. And these companies themselves are dealing with the same things that we are. So you've got teams you've companies who are hiring right now, but their teams are now figuring out, how do you do this process remotely? How do you have a hiring pipeline worked while everybody's working from home? How do you do interviews where you can't have the face-to-face interaction? How do you onboard new employees where there's no going into an office to pick up a computer? So companies who just don't have the experience with the virtual workforce are being forced into an experiment to figure it out. I think we're going to learn some pretty interesting stuff that we'll be talking about a little bit later. But we really look at this, we think like very scientifically as ZipRecruiter, and we look at this as a forced experiment where things that we would have thought would have been either impossible or would have taken years to figure out, got figured out within a matter of a couple of weeks for the most part. You see this in education and everywhere else. So we've got this interesting front row seat to what's going on. And we're all dealing with the same challenges, at least at sort of a corporate level.
Excellent, excellent. Alana?
Yeah, so I'm sure I share a common experience with you and many of your students in terms of classes and conferences and everything now being held over Zoom. And I think that has a couple of really interesting implications for education. A lot of my work focuses on education technology, remote education, and we're seeing just a mass adoption of primarily Zoom, I think, in many cases, or similar conferencing tools as how people are learning today. And you have a bunch of teachers who have not been prepared in terms of how to do digital pedagogy or best practices, trying to figure out everything all at once. And I think it is an amazing experiment. I think we also have to be careful of the lessons we learn from that experiment, since it's not exactly conducted in a it's been expedient rather than necessarily optimal. But also I think it's interesting because a lot of my work also focuses on privacy. And I don't have to tell anyone probably listening to this that Zoom and some of the other platforms have experienced significant issues about privacy and security. And one thing that I'm sure will come out as we continue to talk about is how this crisis is really putting magnifying glass on technologies and infrastructure that we're using, whether that's delivery people or in this case, mobile communication platforms, where it's trial by fire in many ways.
Makes sense. Very helpful, very helpful. Lieutenant Governor, let me ask you now, as we kind of drill down on the future of work in relation to COVID-19, if you were to look at the impact by a sector and by small versus large business, and basically just say what sectors, first of all, do you think are going to be fine and are going to do well maybe with COVID-19? What sectors are you worried about? And then in turn, large companies versus small. We kind of hear a lot that small companies are disproportionate feeling the pain here. Is that fair to say that that's who we need to be most worried about here?
Well, again, there are so many unknown factors, and probably the biggest unknown factor right now is how long is this going to go on? And what is this bridge between stay at home and these very rigid rules to having a vaccine when we kind of put this in our rearview mirror to some degree? And this intermediate time, we really don't know. Of course, a big focus on getting kids back to school, focus on getting businesses open again. If requirements are that you wear a mask, maybe you can sit in a classroom, but you can't really sit in a restaurant with a mask on if you're eating. So a lot of this planning around what that phased approach looks like to safely be in social and business and academic environments again is really going to we're still trying to figure that piece of it out. But I will say this, when I think about this very, very big topic of the future of work, and I do think about it, and the governor in one of the first things he did in his administration was create a commission on the future of work, very first one, because by now most of us do think about it and talk about it and engage in this issue. Overlying on that, COVID makes it very complicated, but I think there are a couple things we can say. One is that all of those things that we've been thinking about and worried about with the impact of technology on work, they're exacerbated by this. And so I think of that in two kind of buckets. You mentioned them. One is, how many jobs are we going to have? And the second is, what are those jobs going to be? And in the how many jobs are we going to have? Well, we now have over 3 million Californians, more than 22 million Americans who have filed for unemployment insurance. These are massive numbers. It wipes out all of the job growth since the Great Recession in California and then some. So this is really significant. And so when we think of those numbers, we have to talk about social safety nets. We have to talk about our tax revenue and how long we can continue to have a social safety net and have safety nets for families. That is one piece of the question. And then the other piece that I think about often with the future of work, as I've said, is what kinds of jobs. Now, that is a central part of the conversation for anyone in California who's involved in public higher education. We have actually about the same number, over 3 million students currently enrolled in public higher education in the state of California. It is my belief that this has been the main reason for our economic success in this state, is the fact that we have trained our workforce, and we continue to do that. We're also pretty flexible. So as the demands that the students put on the system for the courses that they want and the careers that they want and the education they want come at us, we tend to be pretty good at responding to that in a positive way. So, when there's a big influx, as there has been, on people who want nursing careers, we're able to respond. So those are kind of the two big areas I think about on this issue, and try to answer the question you asked of which industries and how these industries will be affected in the context of those two things.
Yeah, and let me just follow up on one additional question on this, Lieutenant Governor, and that's how much of the changes we're seeing with COVID-19 are going to be long-term, that we're going to find there's a new normal here in online education, in e-commerce, that this is just going to be a step function change, and that's going to come to the negative effect of certain industries, retailers, restaurants, commercial real estate, et cetera. Do you feel that a bunch of these changes actually will never get back to the original state?
Well, I think that the fact that we are all living our lives, doing our meetings, doing our work from home online is absolutely going to have a massive impact. People are looking at their cost of real estate, commercial real estate. And again, I think that this crisis has hastened many of the things that were probably, professors nodding, going in that direction anyway. So I think that's one thing. I will say again, because I do, I'm a former US ambassador, and I've been quite focused on the international impacts of all this. We are a service-oriented economy, and some services, like manicures, you can't do remotely, and you can't, have someone in India do for you. But a lot of things, bookkeeping, that type of work, that sort of service can be done by people internationally. And one of the challenges that we've been having is the federal government has really cracked down on H-1B visas and the immigration that has been a huge part of the economic success of California. So if you can have all your employees who happen to live, say in Los Angeles, working from home, then why can't you have some of your workforce in other parts of the world where, frankly, as people are going to be looking for reducing their costs, may end up being very appealing.
Makes sense. Excellent. Matt, let me ask you again on a drill down. I mean, ZipRecruiter, you see what things are posted as jobs, et cetera. What are the trends you're seeing, in what areas are jobs being suspended specifically? And the same question, are you seeing a disproportionate impact on small businesses and kind of a flight to scale, bigger companies, that's going to create a longer term worry for small businesses?
Yeah, and I think you have to look at the mid-February peak that we were at in terms of jobs posted. So this is not, it's related to employment, but it's companies hiring. We hit a peak in mid-February. We've seen an 8-week decline in that number, and an overall about a 38% decline from that mid-February peak until now. And week over week, from this week to last week, was about 11%. So we're not hitting the bottom of this U or V or swoosh, whatever we're coming into. So we have seen that at a macro level across the country, pretty significant impact. And you have to keep in mind, this doesn't really reflect all of the layoffs that have had to happen in the country. This reflects the hiring. And so you have a pullback on hiring and you have a pullback on actual workforce. And so it's created a bigger problem. From an industry point of view, we can kind of guess some of the top industries hit in terms of their hiring: travel, tourism. Nonprofits slide in there because they're not getting money from people right now, or trying to be a little bit more risk averse in their finances. Arts and entertainment, those categories, all sort of like leisure, discretionary categories, are being hit really hard. From a small business and large company point of view, we're seeing that small businesses, to the point on manicures and everything, got hit very quickly, because as soon as things are kind of locked down, you can't go do those things. The larger companies, we're seeing, as the Lieutenant Governor pointed out, a hastening of things that were already happening. So movie theaters were already closing down at a slow rate. We've got a lot of sort of restaurant groups that are highly leveraged that were starting to run into problems as maybe people diversified their choices in going out to dinner. So it's hastening their potential demise or decision-making on what they're going to be doing, maybe pivots that they make, or some financial resources they tap into. But it's going to hasten a lot of those changes that were already in place. I think as it relates to sort of the virtual workforce or working from home, that's, as I mentioned before, it's a forced experiment that happened very quickly for the companies and for the roles that support working from home. And you're going to see some interesting impacts of that, I believe. For the companies that come off of this and embrace it, you are going to see companies shedding commercial real estate, because you can move to maybe a let's call it headquarters, like office adjacent workforce, where maybe I need to go into the office once a week instead of 5 days a week. And so now maybe it's easier for me to live a further distance away than I would have otherwise, or cut back on the commute, or just reduce the commute time I'm spending every week. And so, bedroom communities where people are putting in 1.5-hour commutes that have real impacts to family lives, those might change as well. And then all the second and third order changes that, we could sort of think about all day, but we haven't yet start to see come to light. But we're seeing it definitely more immediately in small businesses, more gradually in larger companies who have the funds to hold on a bit longer. But yeah, it's fascinating to see that things are going to change as a result of this.
Yeah, and Matt, we're already getting a lot of questions in. One of the top questions is, which are the top jobs you think are not coming back at all? Is it fair to say certain types of commercial real estate? I'm writing down movie theaters here. Give us your top 3 or 4 so we can be very careful in those areas.
Yeah, it's not clear that nothing's coming back. I think there's going to be a shift and a reduction. So movie theaters that could be one that it's simply the expensive movie theaters that you do once a year instead of once a month. And so that's going to shift quite a bit. So I don't know that it's fully eliminated, but heavily reduced in terms of their needs for employees, for sure. tourism will eventually come back in some way, shape, or form. I think we'll see some consolidation, probably in airline, hotel, cruise companies for sure. That's going to be a tough one to weather out. We're already seeing with hotels, you know, they have real estate, and so as long as they're on the hook to pay their mortgage, but they don't have any occupancy, they're going to be struggling as well. Again, not going to go away though. So I'm not sure that there's a great answer to the top ones that will not come back.
Okay, fair enough. Alana, you mentioned a minute ago the issues about privacy, and let me expand it just a bit broader to the rights of individuals versus society. So in looking at COVID-19 and the health implications, there seems to be kind of this broader message that the needs of the community have to get upweighted because we're not just at risk of ourselves not being well, but passing that on to somebody else. And as some of these shifts start to occur, and as the Lieutenant Governor mentioned about getting back to work that may require spacing and other things in masks, these all feel like they're oriented around the community a little bit upweighted and the rights of the individual downweighted. Is that a fair summary, and where do you see all that going?
I think that's the way to frame it. But I think it's a limited framework because in the sense of public health is public health. And by protecting the community, you're also protecting yourself and your family. You know, if the hospitals are overrun with COVID cases, people can't have the surgeries they need or get the other health care they need. So I think that's a matter of, and I think people have risen to the occasion fairly well so far, in the sense of understanding that, you know, sheltered home may not be the thing they want to be doing, but not only for their own safety, but for the safety of others, it's important. And I think I think it's an interesting shift from a very kind of personal, individualistic framework to a more community framework where something that we might have thought about as externalities before maybe aren't seen as completely as external and separate.
Yeah, so if I give you a couple of additional examples, you know, there's a lot of cases where people will look and say, who's dealing with COVID-19 well? And countries that'll come up, as you probably know, are China, South Korea to a certain degree, Taiwan, Singapore, and they've been fairly active in quarantining people, contact tracing. Google just announced with Apple they're going to try and do a partnership on contact tracing. But all this kind of raises questions about data privacy, the rights of the individual, et cetera. What is your view on all of that and where that's going in the US?
So I think the temptation is very strong to enact things like contact tracing. And I think there's currently a push to have that be voluntary. I think having it be voluntary may mean it's quite lopsided in terms of its adoption, that people who don't have symptoms may not be traced in it. And with those, you know, many of those countries have more authoritarian regimes where surveillance was not necessarily a choice that many of the population had, and it was followed up often with fairly strict measures to quarantine people forcibly if they made sort of the rules about social distancing. And I would be very hesitant to see that sort of thing enacted here, partly because once that sort of system is set up, it's very difficult to dismantle, and it's extraordinarily difficult to keep secure, especially if it's created in a very hasty way. You know, as we've seen with, you know, Zoom, for example. There are a lot of holes in systems, and it's quite, you know, location data reveals an extraordinary amount of information about individuals' lives, as does healthcare data, and those are sensitive attributes that are difficult to protect. So I can see, you know, I'm not sure what's going to happen with that, but I definitely think people need to proceed carefully and very explicitly build into the processes reviews. So reviews in a month, in 2 months, in 6 months to say, okay, what has happened, what hasn't, and can we dismantle some of this? Can we erase some of the data rather than retain it?
Excellent, good. Let me shift now and do a layering on of the role of technology and automation, as if we don't have enough to worry about in the future of work with COVID-19. If we start looking at future technologies, and Lieutenant Governor, I'm going to start with you. If we look at 3 different technologies here, number one, telehealth. You know, in COVID-19, more and more people are going to see people remotely, et cetera. Let's assume there's some productivity enhancement there that actually reduces the number of people you need in medical care to take care of a set number of people. Autonomous vehicles coming together with ride sharing. So Uber and Lyft have autonomous vehicles that offer the promise of dramatically lower costs in transportation. We won't need to buy cars anymore, but you have this offsetting loss of jobs. There are 3 million people, I think, in the US that are truck drivers and bus drivers alone. Third example, virtual assistants. So the idea of Siri on steroids, that basically you have this broad enhancement of virtual assistants that can act like customer service representatives. And there must be tens of millions of people in the US involved as customer service representatives. So as you look at these technologies and look at the future of work, what is your own take? Is there a massive reduction of jobs coming? Are the jobs going to move to the coast and California will be absolutely fine? Give us your landscape on the role of technology here with work.
Sure. Well, your first point about telehealth. We have so much pent-up demand for healthcare that if we can find efficiencies in treatment, that's great. We're not going to run out of customers. One of the things that I think is a bright spot is that there's a lot of telehealth going on right now. And the barrier to it, my understanding in the past has been that it's not reimbursable. So if you go to your doctor and you go visit your doctor, then it's reimbursable by your insurance company. If your doctor sees you on a health call, then they don't. So those regulations are now shifting as a result of this. And we may be finding efficiencies in healthcare that will actually be great. I think that healthcare is one of those categories that you could expand to, that kind of paints another picture, which is what we are considering to be essential work right now. So anyone who is doing an essential job is still working. So I think that it's a pretty safe bet when you think of people in healthcare, when you think of people in government, when you think of people in food supply, that we know that the kinds of jobs within food supply are changing and will continue to change. And you think about jobs in construction, which, as you know, from the last recession, and probably if we are looking at a major recession, which is what many economists are saying, growing and stimulus is very often associated with construction. In terms of AI and those kinds of things and the impacts, we have a world expert here. I'd actually like to hear her take on how AI is going to change jobs. But I will say one more thing just about service jobs in general. Whenever we have a recession, service jobs are take a hit. People don't have disposable income to be able to go to the movies. One of the things I'm really interested in, will people, now that they are learning how to color their own hair and realize how much less expensive it is than going to a salon, will they start to do that? So what kinds of consumer patterns would never have been disrupted so quickly that are now going to be disrupted in this environment?
My kids just showed me a YouTube clip on Anderson Cooper, who tried to cut his own hair, and there's like a bald spot. So I was thinking the same thing till I saw the bald spot, and I thought maybe I won't try and do that.
Well, this is the haircut from a 7 and a 10-year-old, so I can.
Oh, good. You got very talented 7-year-old and 10-year-olds. Okay, good. So Alana, let me ask you in these areas here, again on this trade-off. So in the future of technology here in healthcare, there are 15, 20 million people in the US that don't have coverage to insurance, partly because it's very, very expensive. You have 18.5% of GDP is being spent in healthcare in the US with outcomes that people would debate whether they're the best or not. You have the ability of technology to drive down costs and improve outcomes, many of which will require access to data and may get rid of jobs in the process of lowering costs. What is your view about, again, these fundamental kind of difficult trade-offs here?
Yeah, I think healthcare is a really interesting option because it's more difficult in some ways to pass on medical knowledge than it is to perhaps the knowledge of how to drive. I mean, there's different challenges with that. But I do think there's a role where you can perhaps provide better quality care for a certain amount of people, and particularly in sort of the lower tier of basic questions. You know, just as you can have a chatbot answer some very basic questions about, you know, if you're applying for a job, what the requirements are, or let's go to the top 3 things that might be wrong with your computer when it's not working. But it becomes more complicated when you think about really the variety of people and sort of human anomalies. You know, a lot of artificial intelligence is trained on particular kinds of people with particular symptoms, and it may not be inclusive for all types of individuals, and it may not represent how health involves with their specific subpopulation, and that's problematic. And you have the sort of what you have in other areas, which is a problem of de-skilling. That, you know, my grandfather was a GP. He could diagnose anything in 3 seconds flat. My cousin maybe not so much, and I think, you know, that's a hard balance there with the sort of being sure that people can still keep up the same skill, because these systems are fallible, and there is some role for common sense that is required.
Excellent. Good, good. Matt, what are you seeing again on the jobs showing up and not with technology? So the impact of technology, and let me add the extra layer, and then I want to go to the Lieutenant Governor on this geographically. Where you're seeing jobs be created and not is basically there's a flight to the coasts. You look at Amazon and their choice of a second headquarters, and it was almost all coastal cities. It was not the center of the country. Are you seeing within the state, and maybe it's more appropriate for the Lieutenant Governor, a flight to the cities, the Bay Area and Los Angeles and San Diego, and not the rest of the state? Tell us geographically where you see the technology impacts playing out.
I think at a national level, a lot of the AI and automation that we think of is more production line automation. You have like the autonomous cars is kind of its own conversation because that has so many other implications within that vertical. But from like production line automation, that's not necessarily pushing jobs out to the coast, because you still have plants in locations with workers, but you require fewer like production line workers, but you do require more people who know how to fix the machines, write the code, and do all that. Now, some of that can be done in, let's say, maybe more larger cities, larger metros. So you're going to have some of that pushing out. But I'll give you an example. So GM is very focused on electric cars and autonomous cars, and they're headquartered in Detroit, as we all know, and they have lots of plants sort of in the outlying areas in Michigan. And they are trying to hire AI engineers, machine learning engineers, all of these types of folks who live on the coast traditionally in New York, Bay Area. They're trying to bring them to Detroit. They're not trying to build sort of innovation hubs on the coast. They do want that to be in Detroit. So they've made a decision to taken a path where they want to bring that there and not push things out. So it's really going to be incumbent upon more companies to make those thoughtful decisions about where they want their sort of centers of excellence to be, where they want to be hiring. Do they want to foster that sense of community that GM already has in that area? That's kind of what we're seeing in more like the production line automation.
Excellent. Lieutenant Governor, what are you seeing in the state and elsewhere?
So 6 weeks ago, we were thinking about the massive $22 billion budget surplus, how to invest in a way that would make our Central Valley more attractive, rural parts of the state more attractive to companies, so that if they're feeling, well, Bay Area housing is too expensive for my workers, maybe I'll go to another state, we can entice them to stay in California. Those conversations, Terry, I mean, everything has really changed. We know from the last recession that the Valley was hit harder. So when, in this new reality that we're in, one of the things that I do think is a bright spot that we can at least focus our attention, even if we don't have the resources exactly that we did, and that is this, the frailty or the vulnerability of international supply chains has become very evident. And we are hearing inquiries of companies that have a piece of a component of a device that they assemble or manufacture and assemble between California and Mexico, between California and the Pacific Rim, and they're thinking, wait a second, why do I want to have this kind of vulnerability in my supply chain? can I onshore this piece so that something like this doesn't happen again? So there's also, of course, with 3D printing, the way that manufacturing is changed may make it more just more feasible to do that as well. So I think that's a bright spot. There are different parts of the valley. It's not all the same, but when you are down here where I am right now in Riverside County, you see a great deal of economic development that's happened over the years through manufacturing. And so I think that's a bright spot. And then also I'll just, keep falling back and reinforcing the importance of education. 3 million students in public higher education in the state. 2.1 million of those are in our community colleges. Career and technical education is really important. Following the lead of the students and responding to the courses that they sign up for is something that's important to hear them and to hear where that demand is. Frankly, we are a special place in the world. We are incredibly diverse. Our values are very attractive to people around the world who want to live in a place where they feel safe and where they feel that they're less likely to stand out as an immigrant. We have 27% of the people in California are foreign born. Half of us have at least one parent who is foreign born. So we are multicultural, we embrace our differences, and that, along with an educated workforce, and this incredibly beautiful place that we call home. And by the way, 25% of our food that's grown right here in state, which is, I believe that's the highest in the United States. These things do give us a platform for growth that many of these pieces will continue to be advantages for us as we look at recovery.
Makes sense. Let me ask each of you a final question before I go to the audience. I got a lot of audience questions here. And this is going to give you a unique opportunity to tell us what you think the role of business leaders are here. So let's assume in the best case with COVID-19 and the future of technology, the best case is there's going to have to be a lot of job reskilling. There's going to be people shifting from industry to industry and location to location. Let's assume in the worst case, there's a net loss of jobs because of autonomous vehicles and automated solutions in healthcare and virtual assistants, et cetera, et cetera. What is the role of business here? And what is the role of government? Are the boundaries of business expanding that actually business needs to start owning a lot of more of this, or that's theoretical, that sounds great, but it's not the mission of a company? Ilana, let me start with you.
Sure. I think there are two pieces of it. I think one is business leaders should ideally try to take a longer term perspective on what is desirable or not in terms of both in terms of ethical practices and sort of sustainability in its broadest sense. So they're not just hustling and, so that they can have an IPO or they can be acquired. I think there's going to be, of course, they have to meet shareholders' interests, but I hope that from this comes a more long-term thoughts about that. Sorry, I just lost track of the other part of the question.
Yeah, so, what job do businesses have broadly in reskilling, taking care of?
So I think that's more and more what's going to happen. I think people are going to have to upskill and reskill continuously to keep on top of technology trends, upon labor shifting market demand as automation shifts where people are needed. And I hope that the government steps up to that, but I also think that it's a large role for corporations in terms of having professional development, allowing people to do the sorts of perhaps online continuing professional training and education that might allow them to train for that next position while they still can earn money for their family or balance competing demands.
Okay, and just to follow on Ilana on this, are you in the camp that says long-term we've got to start thinking about a universal basic income?
Okay. I'm wary of that. I'm wary of that as a panacea. I think there are a lot of other things you can do to create a safety net that can be more directly responsive. You know, you can have things like childcare, better health care. You can do some other things without necessarily having to just hand out money. But, you know, I think we're a little ways from that, hopefully.
Okay, good, good. Matt, your views?
Yeah, I get some personal views here. You know, the customer or companies right now, to Ilana's point, are prioritizing shareholder value, and I think this is a great moment in time to have some perspective on whether or not we should balance worker value, social value, global sort of climate change value, however you want to sort of look at that value back to the earth, and not just shareholder value. And shareholder value is what drives automation to the point of losing jobs, as opposed to striking a balance of efficiency as well as, you know, maybe gaining full employment, for example, coming back to full employment. So I think we're going to have to really take a moment to think about how we want to prioritize the role of businesses going forward. And we have that same challenge as a company, and our customers do as well, and we see that. On the upskilling side of things, we have seen customers get, because of the sort of, well, 6 weeks ago when we were pretty much full employment, people are really struggling to find talent. And especially when we get into conversations about new collar jobs. So moving from the person who's assembling the widget on the production line to the person who's fixing the machine that's assembling the widget. And one is a skill set that you can probably learn in a couple of days and be pretty proficient at. Another one is something that you have to understand the technology behind it, and you have to have different types of problem solving skills. So companies are understanding that finally, and they're building things like an academy where you're hiring people with basic levels of skills or relevant experience in some ways, and then you are building into their ramp up time some of that training and that learning. And the companies who are going to be successful will do that because they're taking their sort of strongest natural resource, performing a little bit of alchemy through time and experience and training, and turning them into productive workers or employees. If you're looking for people who have experience doing your job, but you're only willing to pay them minimum wage, you're gonna have a really hard time pulling that off in a highly competitive market, which we will get back to, I'm very confident. So I think that's a lesson that some companies have started to learn, and this will shine a whole new light on that.
Excellent. Lieutenant Governor?
Well, I'm glad you asked this question, and I don't want to get too deep into political philosophy, but my previous job, I was United States Ambassador to Hungary, and I was in Budapest for almost 4 years, and I learned a lot about how a planned centralized economy works, because they had one in the Soviet Union. And you know, there were stories about how in Hungary you could make buses, but you couldn't make cars. You could make tennis shoes, but you know, you couldn't make something else, whatever. And of course, we know it was an absolute failure. So in the United States, we believe in the free market. We believe that you need to have the ability for people to apply their innovation and their creativity, their resourcefulness, and their hard work to be able to create value, to create jobs. And it's incredibly important that we continue to do that. And as we look at this very deep challenge of consolidation of corporations, automation, leaving workers behind, you know, there is a temptation, of course, for government to step in and really try to bend the free market to the will of the people or the government, which represents the people in our democracy. So there is no more important time now than I think ever in our history to do, Matt, exactly what you are saying, which is for government and the private sector to work together, and for leaders in the private sector to recognize that if the whole society and system of American democracy comes crashing down, that's not going to be good for shareholders either, right? Everybody can't move to New Zealand. So we are all in this together. And there is no, you know, there's a lot of power within the private sector, and there's a lot of power within government and decision making in both. I don't want to underestimate the impact of government decisions when it comes to tax regimes or immigration, trade policy. All of these things are hugely important in determining how business operates. But ultimately, when we are looking at the kind of challenges that this fourth industrial revolution is presenting to us, it is more important than ever than government, the private sector, and of course our incredible people in academia are working together to try to figure out how we navigate this challenging time. And I want to leave just with one more thought, which is that what we have done in California over the course of the last 5 weeks really is incredible. 4 weeks ago, we were looking at models where tens of thousands of people could die in our state. Planning for, on top of the 75,000 hospital beds that we have, another 50,000 hospital beds and all the PPE and all the ventilators that were going to go along with that. And a mortality rate that we couldn't quite, nobody knew how far it was spread. So it's hard to really understand globally what the rate was, but something that was looking very, very bad. And because of the agency of the people of our state, because of the farsightedness and the boldness of leaders, elected leaders in this state, the governor, mayors, Bay Area mayors in particular, and others, to listen to scientists, because in California, we do listen to scientists and we believe in science, acting quickly, and then the incredible fortitude of our people who by and large heard the call, educated themselves, and stayed home. We have avoided an enormous catastrophe. And it makes me hopeful that the challenge that is presented to us for this next phase of bridging our way to a vaccine, that we will be able to work together as a society and meet the moment, as the governor says now almost every day.
Excellent. Let me take a few audience questions before we wrap up here. A few of them I've already posed, but Lieutenant Governor, the first one is to you. Today, the state of Georgia announced they were planning to reopen by the end of April. Do you think California will feel that pressure of reopening, and what will it do?
There's a lot of pressure everywhere to reopen. We are committed to do it safely. Part of the challenge is that we still really don't know exactly how one contracts the virus. We know droplets, of course, but we don't know, for instance, if that paper bag that you get from the grocery store, by touching it, if you touch your face, you can give it to yourself. So part of the challenge here really is that we are looking at, as the governor said, not a flip of a switch, but a dimmer switch, a dimmer light going on. And very dedicated people are looking at every aspect of how we can bring people back into workspaces, classrooms, public spaces in a way that we can make sure that this, what we have avoided, will not, is not something that could come back and we would have to face all over again.
Makes sense. Good. Matt, another question here is, there's a lot of MBAs that are on this webinar. What advice do you have for current Anderson students, specifically with a background in technology and engineering, on job search given the COVID-19 situation?
I guess I'll break that into two categories. One, if you're going to start your own business, now is a great time to look at all the second and third order effects where solutions may not exist today. Working from home, what is that going to mean for all of us in terms of like technology needs, remote learning? So categories where maybe there's been underinvestment in the past because the needs and the demand in the market was relatively low or non-existent. Look at all of those things. Look at your own life, look at your families, look out, outside at other families and see what are they going to be doing differently, 2, 3, 4 years from now, compared to what we're doing now. And that could relate to how we interact in public. That could relate to all sorts of social and business things. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. I'd say one of the interesting ones is restaurants, for example. Restaurants have really become much more real estate game than truly just about food. I live in a part of Los Angeles that has a lot of restaurants on Ventura Boulevard, and you go into those places and they have very high rent, and they're not always charging an arm and a leg for food, so they've got to really rotate people through, jam tables in. Are we going to be cool to jam tables in a restaurant 2 months from now, 3 months from now? Probably not. So you're going to see a move to probably a lot more, let's call it like kitchen only restaurants who are doing takeout and delivery only. So you don't need that expensive real estate on Ventura Boulevard. You can have a commercial kitchen somewhere in a cheaper commercial working area within the neighborhood that you want to serve. So it's things like that. I would look there. In terms of other jobs, for MBAs, I don't think a whole lot of that changed. I think we're in a moment in time where, again, it's harder. Companies are either not hiring right now. It's a little harder to go through the interview process. But as things spin back up and the types of companies that MBAs are likely going to be working for and the types of positions they're going to be looking for, those are going to open back up too. We're going to see a dearth of hiring, hopefully as things open up and as companies have confidence that their workforce is going to expand again.
Yep. You want to give us a forecast what month we'll start seeing the job situation improve?
Personal forecast, July.
July. Okay, good. Excellent. Last question I want to pose to Alana and the Lieutenant Governor. Question is, many disadvantaged people don't have access to basic technologies that we take for granted. How do they participate in the future economy? This whole issue of the digital divide, the income divide, and who owns what solution here? Alana?
Yes, that's extraordinarily important, and especially right now in education. I mean, you have some people who have essentially the equivalent of what they were doing before, and then you have people who are looking at their phones, and it's shaky at best. I think that is something that the government or businesses that are sort of charitably minded will have to think about much harder now, in the sense that it is not an option. It is not, people are not just using the internet to watch movies and talk to their friends on Facebook. And even if they are, those are important things nowadays for your mental health. I think that broadband for everyone, good internet connections, including in rural areas, I think that's truly very important at this stage.
Excellent. Lieutenant Governor?
Well, this wasn't a setup for a pitch, but I take it. Tony Thurmond, our superintendent of schools, and our first partner, Jennifer Newsom, launched an initiative today to raise funds and accept donations to fill this gap. We need about 250,000 tablets or computers for students in public school systems who do not have them. We did a full analysis across the state of where the need is. And already they have raised enough for 70,000, but we still need more. And so for those of you who are watching and saying, what can I do? How can I help? Please, I will happily go to my website, send me an email. I'll happily put you in touch with them. Some generous donations have already come through. Closing the digital divide is huge. And of course, we have a big problem with broadband in the state, and that's something that I think you're going to see more investment in as well.
Excellent. Let me do this in closing. I always like to kind of think about what my own takeaways were from listening to all of you, and I'm going to share 3 points I took away and give you a chance to upgrade it. If you've got something I've missed, you want to add it, you want to change whatever I say, feel free to do so. I got 3 takeaways. One is that the types of problems and issues that we're dealing with are fairly complex, and we all, as rising leaders at Anderson, need to be listening to experts and understanding deeply the facts. This is not a place to wing it, to use a lot of gut on things, but these are things that require a fair amount of analysis and, again, listening to experts. The second point that I got is think about the second order effects, the domino game, the chess game, that there may be a new normal, and how are you going to reposition what you want to do as an individual? How should businesses reposition, et cetera? But it's kind of that second order effect is something we should be thinking about. And the third one is this broad message about the role of business leaders, is that we should, as opposed to kind of running to government and saying government owns 18 of these things, we need to be thinking first, what can we do? Because if you can harness kind of that unique capability of entrepreneurs and business people in taking on broader issues, you've got a better outcome than somebody dealing business with solutions they may not like. Those are the three takeaways that I got. Any upgrades or add-on messages to that? You're going to feel like you're students in my class.
Well, just as a privacy data person, I will say, before you do anything with lots of data, think about it, talk to a lawyer.
Okay.
It's for
we can
myself.
do that. If you want to put in a plug, any specific lawyer or?
Oh, no. All of my students who are graduating will be good to go.
Okay, excellent.
I have a message to all those MBA students out there. I got my MBA from another University of California school. But no matter what you do, always find a way to engage in your civic life. Always find a way to be part of your community. And for those of you who may find that you can put your MBA to use in ways that are entirely devoted to our democracy and to our civic life and to nonprofits, look at those opportunities too.
Excellent. Well said. Matt?
Great summary, and I'll throw my UC San Diego Triton hat to the ring all out.
Okay, go Bears.
We need to work on you guys being UCLA alums, but for now, it's all part of the UC system. We will take that. Listen, let me just say a big thank you, first of all, to the three of you for insights and helping us understand the issues and what the role of leadership is here. Lieutenant Governor, Matt, and Alana, I just want to say a big thank you to all of you. I want to thank all of our attendees on this, the number of questions and their commitment to understanding these issues as good leaders came across well. And I want to thank our Dean, Tony Bernardo, who's kind of set a context that we all own these leadership issues. We all need to be thinking about these in an interdisciplinary, cross-campus, cross-state, cross-world basis. A big thank you to all of you guys, and we'll look forward to continuing the dialogue with you. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.